Welcome back to the Gemara on Pei Hey Amud Aleph, starting from Ripui. Ripui hikahu chayav l'rapoto v'chulei, the quote from the Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan, alubo tzmachi machmad hamakah v'nistera hamakah, chayav l'rapoto. If swellings or lesions emerged on the wound and the wound reopened, the injurer is obligated to pay for refuah. V'chayav li'ten lo dmei shivto, and is obligated to give him the money for shevet as well. Shalom machmat hamakeh, ino chayav l'rapoto, ve'ino chayav li'ten lo dmei shivto. And if the wound, something happens, not as a result of the original wound, then the injurer does not have to pay ripui or shevet. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af machmat hamakah chayav l'rapoto, ve'ino chayav li'ten lo dmei shivto. Even if it is in fact machmat hamakah, that the wound reopened or sores emerged, nonetheless, he only has to pay ripui and not shevet. B'chachamim omrim, shivto v'refuato. Kol shechayav b'shevet, chayav b'ripui. V'she'ino chayav b'shevet, eino chayav b'ripui. So the chachamim say that shivto and refuato, the two go together. Anyone who's obligated in shevet is obligated in ripui, and if you're not obligated in shevet, you're not obligated in ripui. B'mai kemiflagei, what are they arguing about? Amar Rabba, ashlachtin hu l'Rabbanan b'dei Rav, diyat veveka amrei. Hacha b'makah nitna la'aged kemiflagei. So Rabba says, I found the rabbis in the house of Rav, and they were sitting and saying, here they're arguing about whether or not it's permissible to bind up a wound. Rashi tells us this is binding a wound for comfort, let's say because the person is cold. Whether or not you're allowed to do it, knowing that it could cause secondary infection. Rabbanan Savre, makah nitna la'aged. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, makeh lo nitna la'aged. So the rabbis think that a wound, it's permissible to bind up a wound in this way, and Rabbi Yehuda thinks that you're not allowed to bind up a wound in this way. So if you are allowed to, then obviously the injured is not held responsible for having bound it up, and it's considered to be still the fault of the injurer. But if you weren't allowed to do that, then it's now the injured's fault instead of the fault of the injurer. Ripui, now we're going to explain, so I can put a comma here really. Ripui the Tana Beikra mechayev shevet. Zelo Tana Beikra, mechayev. Shevet zelo Tana Beikra lo mechayev. And this is going on in the explanation of Rabbi Yehuda. Ripui, which is mentioned twice, which is repeated by the pasuk, the injurer is obligated, but shevet, which was only said once in that pasuk, the injurer is not chayev, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda has a distinction between the two. So makeh lo nitna la'aged, so the injurer is still obligated to pay ripui since that's repeated twice in the pasuk, but since it was on some level the injured's fault because he shouldn't have bound it up in this way, so he doesn't have to pay shevet, which is mentioned only once in the pasuk. V'amina lehu ana, this is Rabba speaking again, I said to them, right, to these rabbis, if you're really not allowed to bind up the wound, if permission really isn't given, then ripui also the injurer shouldn't be obligated for, right? It doesn't make any sense to read Rabbi Yehuda's position this way, according to Rabba. Ella d'chui alma makeh nitna la'aged. Rather, everyone agrees that you're allowed to bind up a wound, even for comfort. V'lo nitna la'aged yetera, but you're not allowed to bind it excessively. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, kivan lo nitna la'aged yetera, ripui z'tana beikra mechayev shevet. Mechayev shevet lo tana beikra lo mechayev. So this is Rabba explaining Rabbi Yehuda's position. So Rabbi Yehuda thinks that since you're not allowed to do excessive bandaging, ripui, which gets repeated twice by the verse, the injurer is chayev in, but shevet, which was only mentioned once, the injurer is not chayev in that case where excessive binding was done. For Rabbanan Savri, and the rabbis hold, Kivan detanabe kra beripui, ashevet nami mechayev. Since the pasuk repeats ripui, the injurer is also chayev for shevet to eat kasher ripui because it's connected to ripui, right? They're connected in the pasuk. They're connected in the pasuk. For Rabbi Yehuda Savar, and Rabbi Yehuda thinks shevet lo mechayev. Going back to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, he thinks that shevet is not required, even though ripui is. Dima'ate rachmana rak, because the Torah used the word rak, which is a mute. So rak shivto yiten v'rapo yirapeh. The Rabbi Yehuda would say, breaks up the hekesh. It doesn't exist. They're not connected. They're two separate cases. V'Rabbanan rak l'shalom achmat hamakeh hudata. And for the rabbis, the word rak comes to exclude cases of shalom achmat hamakeh. So it's also a mute. Rak is always a mute, but it comes to tell you that the attacker, the injurer, is not chayev for secondary infections that came as a result, not as a result of the wound. U'Rabbanan batrai da'amri kol shechayav b'shevet chayav b'ripui v'kol she'ino chayav b'shevet ino chayav b'ripui. So for the last set of rabbis, at the end of the Breita, who say that anytime you're chayav in shevet, you're chayav in ripui, and if you're not chayav in shevet, you're not chayav in ripui. Ripui is tanabe kra lamali. Then why was ripui repeated twice, right? What does it get that's extra if they're always going to be linked? Mibayale, it's necessary. Look at Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, to Tanya de Rabbi Yishmael, as it was taught by the house of Rabbi Yishmael, or Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Sorry, v'rapo yirapeh. The verse says v'rapo yirapeh. Mikan shinitan reshut l'rofeh l'rapot. From here we learn that permission was given to the doctor to heal. Tana Rabbanan. Minayin she'imalu bo tzmachim machmat hamaka v'nistara hamaka shechayav l'rapoto v'chayav litan lo shivto. So how do we know that if sores arose as a result of the wound and the wound reopens, that the injurer has to give both ripui and shevet? Talmud Lamar rak. Talmud Lamar rak shivto yiten v'rapo yirapeh. Because it says this pasuk. And that's how you know that you're obligated for both. Both appear in this pasuk. Yachol afil shalom achmat hamakeh. You might think this applies even when it doesn't result directly from the original wound. Talmud Lamar rak. And therefore it teaches us rak. This is essentially what we just said is the position of the Rabbanan Batrai, you're not obligated for it if it's not as a result of the original wound. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer, af machmat hamaka patur. Even if it is as a result of the wound, you are patur, you don't have to pay. Shina emar rak, because the pasuk says rak, which again is a mute, and this is still part of this Breita. So this is a mute, and it excludes even the case of machmat hamakeh, according to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Ikeda amre, there are those who say af machmat hamakeh patur legamre. So there are those who read Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda as saying you're totally patur from all payments, even machmat hamakeh. Which would be a pretty radical statement. Rabbanan Batrai, like the Rabbanan Batrai in our previous Breita. So you could say that again, this is one explanation of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, right? That you're not at all chayev, because if you're not chayev in one, then you're not chayev in the other. The Iked Amri, and there are those who say, Af machmat hamakeh patur mishevet v'chayav v'ripui. That what Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda really meant was that that even if it's machmat hamakeh, you're patur from shevet, but you're still chayav in ripui. Kiman, like whose position is this? Kavua, it's like his father's. So in other words, it sounds like the Gemara is concluding it's most logical that Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda is actually giving a position that aligns with his father's, that it's possible to be chayav in Ripui and not in Shevet, because the miyut of rock separates them, excludes Shevet sometimes, even when Ripui is what's obligated. Okay, we'll pause here.